The sound of honking horns and diesel engines filled the air as Nolan Carter pulled his black sedan into the pickup lane at Metro International Airport. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the morning rush was already building like a storm on the horizon. But what caught his attention wasn't the usual chaos of travelers dragging suitcase wheels across cracked pavement. It was the argument happening just 20 feet from his car. "You can't just cancel our contracts without notice." The voice belonged to Maria Santos, a woman Nolan recognized from his own neighborhood. She drove for the same rideshare company that had recently slashed driver payments by 30%. A man in an expensive suit, corporate logo embroidered on his chest, shrugged with a kind of indifference that came from never having to worry about rent money. "New efficiency protocols. The company needs to maximize shareholder value. You're independent contractors, not employees. Read your terms of service." Nolan watched through his windshield as Maria's face crumpled. Behind her, a dozen other drivers shifted uncomfortably, their phones buzzing with cancellation notifications that would devastate their families' budgets before breakfast was over. "Sir, I've got 3 kids and a mortgage," Maria pleaded. "This job was supposed to cover our groceries for the month. You can't just..." "Take it up with customer service," the corporate representative interrupted, already walking toward a waiting luxury SUV. "We're streamlining operations. Market forces, you understand." Market forces. Nolan's jaw tightened. He knew those words well. They were the same ones used when his neighbor Jake had lost his house last month. The same ones that appeared in the legal notice taped to Mrs. Swan Chen's apartment door just 3 weeks ago. As the corporate man disappeared into his SUV, Nolan's passenger door opened with a soft click. The woman who slipped into his back seat moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened for her. Designer heels, perfectly tailored blazer, manicured fingers that had never changed a tire or scrubbed a floor. She settled into the leather seat with the practiced ease of wealth. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone of boardroom authority. "Carmen Sinclair. I assume you received the details about our destination." Nolan glanced in the rearview mirror, taking in her sharp cheekbones and calculating eyes. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where they might have met. "Downtown Financial District," he confirmed, pulling away from the curb. "Traffic's heavy this morning. Should take about 40 minutes. As they merged into the flow of morning commuters, Nolan couldn't shake the image of Maria's desperate face. The woman's words kept echoing in his head. 3 kids and a mortgage. He knew that struggle intimately. Single parenthood had taught him exactly how quickly financial security could evaporate. "Terrible situation back there," Carmen said unexpectedly, as if reading his thoughts. "All those drivers getting their contracts terminated." Nolan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "You saw that? Hard to miss." Her reflection met his eyes in the mirror. Economic restructuring is never pleasant for the people caught in the middle, but companies have to adapt to survive. The casual dismissal in her voice triggered something cold in Nolan's chest. This wasn't theoretical for him. These were his neighbors, his community. "Easy to say when you're not the one losing your livelihood," he replied, keeping his voice professionally neutral despite the heat building behind his words. Carmen leaned forward slightly. "You sound like you have personal experience with corporate downsizing." Personal experience. Nolan almost laughed at the clinical terminology. "My neighbor Jake drove for Meridian Transport for 4 years. 60-hour weeks, never missed a shift. Company cut driver compensation last month, then terminated his contract when he complained about the working conditions." He caught her sharp intake of breath in the mirror. "Jake's got a disabled daughter," Nolan continued, navigating through a maze of delivery trucks and taxis. Medical bills, therapy sessions, specialized equipment. Losing that income meant losing his house. Families living in a motel now while he fights the eviction. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tension. Carmen's fingers drummed against her purse, a nervous gesture that seemed out of character with her composed exterior. "Meridian Transport," she repeated quietly. "That's unfortunate." Something in her tone made Nolan look more closely at her reflection. The way she avoided eye contact, the slight tension around her mouth, Recognition hit him like a physical blow. He'd seen her face before, not in person, but plastered across the business section of the local newspaper. The young CEO who'd taken over her father's transportation empire, the woman whose company had been in the headlines for their aggressive cost-cutting measures. The woman stepping into his car wasn't just wealthy, she was the reason his neighbor lost his house. "You're Carmen Sinclair," he said, the words coming out harder than he'd intended. "Sinclair Industries." Her composure cracked just enough to reveal something vulnerable underneath. "I am. Meridian Transport is your subsidiary company." "Yes." The admission hung between them like a lit fuse. Nolan's mind raced through everything he knew about Sinclair Industries. The layoffs, the benefit cuts, the systematic destruction of worker protections that had left families like Jake's homeless and desperate. Behind them, a horn honked impatiently, jolting him back to the present. They were stopped at a red light, other commuters streaming around them, like water around a stone. "Those drivers back at the airport," Nolan said, his voice carefully controlled. "Maria Santos. She's got 3 kids and lives 2 streets over from me. That man in the suit who dismissed her concerns, he works for you." Carmen's reflection showed a woman wrestling with something painful. The board demanded cost reductions. Shareholders expect. Shareholders. The word came out like a curse. While Maria's kids are asking why mommy is crying over the grocery bill. The light turned green, and Nolan pressed the accelerator perhaps a little too forcefully. The city blurred past them. Gleaming office towers built on the backs of people like Jake and Maria, who were now being discarded like used equipment. "I know how this looks," Carmen said finally. "But business decisions affect thousands of people. Sometimes difficult choices have to be made for the greater good of the company." Greater good. Nolan's daughter Ivy flashed through his mind. Her bright smile, her dreams of college, her innocent trust that her father would always be able to provide for her. "Tell me, Miss Sinclair, when was the last time you had to choose between your child's medication and paying rent?" The question landed with devastating precision. In the mirror, he watched her face pale. They were approaching downtown now, the financial district rising before them like a monument to inequality. Somewhere in one of those towers, decisions were being made that would destroy more families, ruin more lives, all in the name of quarterly profits. And sitting in his back seat was the woman with the power to stop it all. The silence in the car became suffocating. Carmen stared out the tinted window at the bustling sidewalks, but Nolan could see her reflection studying his face in the glass. She was calculating, weighing her options like a chess master contemplating her next move. "You think I'm a monster," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Nolan navigated around a double-parked delivery truck, buying himself time to consider his response. The easy answer would be yes. The woman sitting behind him had made decisions that destroyed lives. But something in her tone, a crack in that polished corporate armor, made him pause. "I think you're powerful," he replied carefully. "And power without accountability is dangerous." Carmen's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Power. You have no idea what real power looks like, do you?" Before Nolan could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, and her entire body tensed. "I have to take this." Her voice shifted back into corporate mode, crisp and authoritative. "Richard, good morning." Even through the phone's speaker, Nolan could hear the aggressive tone of the man on the other end. Richard's voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The airport terminations went smoothly?" Richard demanded. "Board meeting is in 2 hours. They want confirmation that we've eliminated the problematic drivers." Carmen's eyes met Nolan's in the rearview mirror. For a split second, he saw something raw and conflicted before she looked away. "Yes," she said into the phone. "The efficiency protocols are being implemented as discussed." "Good. And the legal team confirmed these drivers can't file for unemployment benefits?" "Correct. Independent contractor status protects us from those obligations." Nolan's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. Maria's tearful face flashed through his mind again. 3 kids, no income, no safety net. "Excellent," Richard continued. "Stock price jumped 12% after we announced the cost reductions. Investors are thrilled with your leadership, Carmen. Your father would be proud." At the mention of her father, Carmen's composure wavered. "I'll see you at the meeting, Richard." She ended the call and immediately buried her face in her hands. The transformation was startling. Gone was the confident CEO, replaced by a woman who looked utterly exhausted. Her shoulders shook slightly, and Nolan realized she was fighting back tears. "Problematic drivers," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "That's what we call people now. Problems to be solved." They were stopped at another red light. The morning rush hour had turned the streets into a parking lot, giving Nolan an unwelcome front-row seat to Carmen's breakdown. "Those board meetings Richard mentioned," Nolan said quietly. "You didn't want to terminate those drivers, did you?" Carmen's head snapped up, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "Want doesn't factor into business decisions. The company was hemorrhaging money. Shareholders demanded action." "But you didn't want to." "No." The admission came out like a confession. "I didn't want to." Traffic began moving again, and Nolan pressed forward through the congested streets. Around them, the city hummed with the energy of people trying to make their way in an economy that seemed increasingly hostile to their survival. "Then why did you do it?" he asked. Carmen was quiet for so long that Nolan wondered if she'd decided not to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of accumulated compromise. "My father built Sinclair Industries from nothing," she began. "Immigrant family, worked construction jobs to put himself through business school. He believed companies should take care of their workers, provide stable employment, decent benefits." She paused, watching the cityscape roll by. "When he died 2 years ago, the board was ready to sell the company, break it up, auction off the pieces to the highest bidders. Thousands of jobs would have disappeared overnight. So you took over instead." "I took over to preserve his legacy, to keep the company intact." Her voice cracked slightly. "But the board made it clear from day one that sentiment doesn't pay dividends. Every quarter they demand higher profits. Every meeting they threaten a vote of no confidence if I don't deliver results." Nolan found himself seeing the situation from a different angle. "And if they remove you?" "They'll bring in someone who won't hesitate to gut the entire operation. Mass layoffs, facility closures, offshore, everything that can be moved. The board calls it maximizing shareholder value." They passed a group of construction workers on their lunch break, men and women who reminded Nolan of Carmen's father. People who built things with their hands, who understood the value of honest work. "So you're destroying some jobs to save others," Nolan said. "I tell myself that every night." Carmen's reflection showed a woman carrying an impossible burden. Cut 1,000 drivers to keep 10,000 factory workers employed. Reduce benefits for some to maintain paychecks for others. The math is brutal, but it's the only way to keep the company alive. "But those aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet," Nolan pressed. "Those are real people. Maria Santos, Jake Miller, families with children and mortgages and dreams. You think I don't know that?" The words came out sharper than intended, revealing the pain beneath her corporate facade. "You think I sleep well at night, knowing that my decisions put families on the street?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. 3 weeks ago, I had to approve the termination of a driver whose daughter has leukemia. The medical bills were bankrupting him, and he'd been picking up extra shifts to pay for her treatments. My signature on that termination letter meant that little girl might not get her next round of chemotherapy. Tears were flowing freely now, cutting through her carefully applied makeup. "But if I hadn't signed it, if I hadn't shown the board I was willing to make the hard choices, they would have voted me out that same day. And the executive they'd bring in would have fired not just that driver, but everyone in his entire division." The weight of her words settled over them both. Nolan had expected to find a heartless corporate villain. Instead, he discovered a woman trapped between impossible choices, carrying the guilt of decisions no human being should have to make. "Every day I compromise a little more of what I believe is right," Carmen continued. "Every day I tell myself it's for the greater good. But late at night, when I'm alone in my office, I wonder if I'm just another corporate monster, making excuses for the inexcusable." They were approaching the financial district now. Glass towers reached toward the sky, monuments to an economic system that seemed designed to concentrate wealth while dispersing suffering. "The board meeting this morning," Carmen said, composing herself slightly. "They're going to present a proposal to cut another 1,500 driver positions. They want my approval to implement it by the end of the week. And will you give it?" Carmen stared out at the corporate headquarters that awaited her, the place where she'd spend the next several hours making decisions that would echo through countless lives. "I don't know," she admitted. "I honestly don't know anymore." As they pulled up to the imposing entrance of Sinclair Industries, Nolan found himself facing a question he'd never expected. What would he do in her position? How do you choose between terrible and catastrophic when those are your only options? What do you think about corporate leaders who claim they're trapped by shareholder pressure? Are they making impossible choices or just making excuses? Comment below and let me know if you've ever seen a company prioritize profits over people in your own community. 3 days passed before Nolan heard from Carmen again. 3 days of driving other passengers through the same streets where he'd witnessed her breakdown, wondering if their conversation had changed anything or if she'd simply retreated back into the corporate machinery that seemed to control her every decision. On Friday afternoon, while waiting in the pickup line at Ivy's elementary school, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Need to talk. Urgent. Coffee shop on 5th and Main. Come alone." David Chen, Sinclair Industries Finance. Nolan stared at the message, his pulse quickening. Chen. The same last name as Mrs. Chen his early neighborhood received the eviction notice. Coincidence seemed unlikely. Ivy bounded out of school, her backpack bouncing as she ran toward his car. At 9 years old, she possessed an infectious enthusiasm that could brighten even his darkest moods. "Dad, guess what happened in math class today?" She climbed into the passenger seat, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Rodriguez said I solved a problem even some middle schoolers couldn't figure out." "That's incredible, sweetheart." Nolan ruffled her dark hair, trying to push away thoughts of the mysterious text message. "Tell me about it." As they drove home, Ivy chattered about fractions and word problems, but Nolan's mind kept drifting to David Chen and whatever urgent information he wanted to share. The timing felt significant, just days after Carmen's emotional confession about being trapped by board pressure. After settling Ivy at home with homework and a snack, Nolan made his way to the coffee shop. The place buzzed with the usual mix of students, freelancers, and business people grabbing afternoon caffeine fixes. He spotted David Chen immediately, a thin man in his 40s, sitting alone at a corner table with nervous energy radiating from his hunched shoulders. "You're Nolan Carter," Chen said as he approached. It wasn't a question. "And you're Mrs. Chen's grandson." Nolan slid into the opposite chair, the financial analyst who used to visit her every Sunday before she got that eviction notice. David's face crumpled. "She raised me after my parents died. That apartment was her home for 37 years. The rent increase that forced her out, that came directly from a memo I helped write." He pulled out a thick manila envelope, his hands shaking slightly. "I've been working in Sinclair's finance department for 8 years. I believed in the company, believed we were different from other corporations. But what I've discovered..." He shook his head. "Carmen Sinclair isn't trapped by the board. She's actively orchestrating the worst of it." Nolan felt his stomach drop. "What are you talking about?" "The driver terminations, the rent increases, the benefit cuts. They're not desperate moves to save the company. They're calculated strategies to inflate stock prices before a planned merger." David opened the envelope, revealing spreadsheets, internal emails, and financial projections. "Look at this." He pointed to a series of numbers. "Company profits are actually up 18% this year. The cost-cutting measures aren't about survival. They're about making Sinclair Industries attractive to Global Corp for acquisition." The documents painted a devastating picture. Email chains showing Carmen coordinating with board members to time layoffs for maximum stock impact. Financial models demonstrating how worker terminations would boost the company's valuation. Merger discussions that had been ongoing for months. "But I saw her break down." Nolan protested. She was genuinely upset about the human cost of these decisions. Maybe she was. Maybe she started with good intentions. David's voice carried the weight of disillusionment. But look at this email from last week. He slid a printed message across the table. Carmen's name appeared in the sender field, dated just 2 days after her emotional confession in Nolan's car. Richard, the airport terminations exceeded projections. Driver reduction strategy should yield additional 7% cost savings by month end. Proceed with Phase 2 eliminations as discussed. The Global Corp negotiations are on track. CS. The words hit Nolan like a physical blow. While Carmen had been crying about impossible choices and moral compromises, she'd been planning the next wave of terminations. Phase 2 eliminates another 2,000 positions, David continued, including maintenance workers, dispatchers, and administrative staff, people who've been with the company for decades. Nolan's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Carmen's name appeared on the screen. "Don't answer it," David warned. "She's been monitoring employee communications since the rumors started about someone collecting evidence against the company." The phone continued ringing as Nolan stared at Carmen's contact information. The woman who'd seemed so vulnerable, so conflicted about her difficult position, had apparently been manipulating him from the beginning. "There's more," David said quietly. "The merger with Global Corp includes provisions to move all operations offshore within 2 years. Every remaining job in this city will disappear." Carmen negotiated a $50 million golden parachute for herself. The coffee shop sounds faded into background noise as the full scope of the deception became clear. Carmen hadn't been trapped by board pressure. She'd been the architect of the entire strategy. "Why are you telling me this?" Nolan asked. "Because you're the only person I've seen her show any genuine emotion around. Maybe she actually cares what you think. Maybe you can get through to whatever conscience she has left." David stood to leave, but paused at Nolan's shoulder. "Or maybe she's playing you too. Either way, these documents go public next week unless something changes. The people of this city deserve to know what's being done to them." After David left, Nolan sat alone with the evidence spread across the table. Email after email revealed Carmen's active participation in destroying the livelihoods of thousands of families. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of her tears, the genuine pain in her voice when she'd spoken about the leukemia patient's daughter. His phone rang again. "Carmen." This time he answered. "Nolan, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day." Her voice carried warmth that now felt calculated. "I'd like to see you again. Perhaps dinner?" "I'm busy," he replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Tomorrow then, I could cook for you and Ivy. I'd love to meet your daughter." The mention of Ivy sent alarm bells through Nolan's head. "That's not a good idea. Please, I know our last conversation was heavy, but I've made some decisions about the company's direction. I think you'd be pleased with the changes I'm implementing." More lies, probably. But Nolan found himself curious about what Carmen would say now that he knew the truth. "Sunday afternoon," he heard himself saying. "My place." After ending the call, Nolan gathered David's evidence and drove home with his mind racing. How do you confront someone you're beginning to care about with proof of their deception? How do you protect your daughter from someone whose true nature remained a mystery? That evening, as Ivy practiced piano in the living room, Nolan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief but chilling. "Stop digging or your daughter pays the price. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Nolan's blood ran cold. He rushed to the window, scanning the street for unfamiliar cars or suspicious figures. Everything looked normal, but the threat felt real. From the living room came the gentle sound of Ivy playing Für Elise, her small fingers navigating the complex melody with remarkable skill. She was completely absorbed in her music, unaware that her father's world was collapsing around a web of corporate corruption and personal betrayal. The evidence sat on his kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. In less than 48 hours, Carmen would be in his home, meeting his daughter, probably weaving more lies about her noble intentions and impossible choices. And somewhere in the shadows, people were willing to threaten a child to keep their secrets hidden. Sunday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made promises feel possible. Nolan had spent the morning cleaning his modest apartment, unsure why he bothered when Carmen had already seen the contrast between her world and his. The manila envelope from David Chen sat hidden in his bedroom drawer, its contents weighing on his conscience like lead. At exactly 2 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up outside his building. But instead of Carmen stepping out alone, Nolan watched through his window as she emerged carrying grocery bags and what appeared to be ingredients for an elaborate meal. What she didn't expect was the crowd gathered in the parking lot of the community center across the street. Nearly 50 neighbors had assembled, their faces grim with determination. Nolan recognized most of them. Jake Miller, still displaced from his foreclosed home. Maria Santos, whose rideshare income had vanished overnight. Mrs. Patterson, whose son had been laid off from the Sinclair warehouse just last month. Carmen paused at the entrance to Nolan's building, her attention drawn to the growing crowd and the makeshift podium someone had erected. "Daddy, who are all those people?" Ivy asked, pressing her face against the living room window. Before Nolan could answer, his phone rang. It was Jake Miller. "Nolan, we need you down here. Community meeting about Sinclair Industries. We're organizing a response to the layoffs, and your voice carries weight in this neighborhood." Through the window, Nolan could see Carmen still standing frozen on the sidewalk, grocery bags in hand, watching the crowd with growing unease. "I'll be right down," he told Jake. "Can I come too?" Ivy asked, bouncing with curiosity. Nolan hesitated. The anonymous threat from Friday night still echoed in his mind, but keeping Ivy isolated wouldn't protect her from the larger forces reshaping their community. "Stay close to me," he said, taking her small hand in his. They descended to the parking lot just as Maria Santos stepped up to speak. Her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd, each word weighted with the frustration of families pushed to their breaking point. "Sinclair Industries has been part of this community for 40 years, Maria began. "My father worked in their warehouse. My brother drove for their transport division. We believed they were different from other corporations because they hired local, supported local businesses, treated workers like family." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But family doesn't abandon you when times get tough. Family doesn't cut your health benefits when your child gets sick. Family doesn't eliminate your job to boost stock prices for shareholders who've never set foot in our neighborhood." Carmen had moved closer, positioning herself at the edge of the crowd. She was still holding the grocery bags, but her knuckles had gone white around the handles. Jake Miller stepped forward next. "3 generations of my family worked for Sinclair. My grandfather helped build their original facility. My father spent 35 years on their loading docks. I drove their routes for 4 years, never missed a day, got commendations for safety and customer service." His voice cracked slightly. "None of that mattered when they needed to cut costs. They terminated my contract with 2 days' notice. No severance, no help with job placement, no acknowledgement of years of faithful service." Carmen's face had gone pale. She was seeing the human consequences of spreadsheet decisions for the first time, watching real people describe the devastation that corporate efficiency had brought to their lives. "My daughter Emma has cerebral palsy," Jake continued. "The insurance through Sinclair covered her physical therapy, her medications, her adaptive equipment. When they cut me loose, they cut her lifeline too. She's 8 years old and she's asking me why she can't go to therapy anymore." Several people in the crowd were crying now. Carmen took a step backward, as if the weight of their stories was physically pushing her away. Mrs. Patterson raised her voice from the middle of the crowd. "My son worked in their accounting department for 12 years. They laid him off last month with a form letter. A form letter. After 12 years of dedication, they couldn't even tell him face to face." "We're not just numbers on a balance sheet," Maria added, her voice growing stronger. "We're members of this community. We shop at local businesses, volunteer at the schools, coach Little League, organize food drives. When Sinclair destroys our livelihoods, they're destroying the fabric of this entire neighborhood." Ivy tugged on Nolan's sleeve. "Daddy, why is everyone so sad?" Before he could answer, a voice from the back of the crowd called out, "Look who decided to show up." All heads turned toward Carmen, who stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights. Someone had recognized her, and the news was spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "That's her," Maria pointed directly at Carmen. That's Carmen Sinclair, the CEO who signed the termination orders. The crowd's energy shifted instantly from grief to anger. People began moving toward Carmen, their voices rising in accusation and demand. How can you sleep at night? Do you know what you've done to our families? Look at us. Look at what your decisions have cost. Carmen dropped the grocery bags, their contents scattering across the pavement. She looked terrified, overwhelmed by the raw emotion directed at her. Nolan found himself stepping between Carmen and the crowd, even though part of him wanted to let her face the full force of their justified anger. "Everyone, please," he called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Let her speak. Let her see what her choices have done." The crowd reluctantly stepped back, but their eyes remained fixed on Carmen, with a mixture of fury and desperate hope that somehow, facing them directly, might change something. Carmen stood there for a long moment, her corporate composure completely shattered. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know your names," she said, looking directly at Jake. "Emma. Your daughter's name is Emma." "She loves horses," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up. But the therapy she needs to strengthen her legs, to help her walk without assistance, we can't afford it anymore." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. "I signed your termination papers. I never thought about Emma." She turned to Maria. "3 children. You said you had 3 children at the airport." "Rosa, Miguel, and baby Sophia," Maria confirmed. "Sophia's only 18 months old. Without my rideshare income, I can't afford daycare for her while I look for other work. I might have to give up custody to my mother because I can't provide for them." Each name, each story, each consequence seemed to hit Carmen like a physical blow. The abstract concept of cost reduction was becoming real in ways her boardroom had never allowed her to see. "Mrs. Patterson," Carmen said, remembering the accounting department layoffs. "Your son? What was his name?" "David," Mrs. Patterson replied. "David Chen." The revelation struck Nolan like lightning. David Chen, the whistleblower who'd given him the evidence, was Mrs. Patterson's son. The financial analyst who'd helped write the policies that displaced his own grandmother. "He's been working nights as a security guard, trying to find another accounting position," Mrs. Patterson continued. "But companies want younger candidates, and at 45, he's struggling to compete." Carmen was crying openly now, all pretense of corporate control abandoned. "I told myself I was saving jobs," she said to the crowd. "I convinced myself that cutting some positions would preserve the company for everyone else. But you're right, I never looked at the faces. I never learned the names. I turned people into problems to be solved instead of human beings with families and dreams and needs." Ivy, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, suddenly walked over to Carmen. Without hesitation, she reached up and took Carmen's hand. "It's okay to cry when you're sorry," Ivy said simply. "My daddy taught me that. Tears mean you want to fix things." The gesture broke something open in Carmen's chest. She knelt down to Ivy's level, looking into the trusting eyes of a child who saw complexity where adults saw only condemnation. "What if someone wanted to fix things?" Carmen asked the crowd, her voice stronger now. "What if someone wanted to use their resources to make this right?" Do you believe companies have a responsibility to serve the communities where they operate? Share the story if you think corporate leaders should face the human cost of their decisions firsthand. Monday morning arrived with the weight of revolution hanging in the air. Carmen hadn't slept, spending the night pacing her penthouse apartment while replaying every face from the community meeting, every name, every story of families destroyed by decisions she'd signed without question. The Sinclair Industries boardroom occupied the entire 40th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city below. Normally, Carmen found comfort in that elevated perspective, the way it made the world's problems seem small and manageable from such heights. Today, those same windows felt like barriers separating her from the reality she'd finally been forced to confront. The board members filed in at precisely 9 o'clock. Their expensive suits and confident demeanor radiating the kind of power that came from never having to worry about mortgage payments or medical bills. Richard Blackwood, the board chairman, took his seat directly across from Carmen with the satisfied expression of a man expecting good news about profit margins. Excellent work with Phase 2 implementations, Richard began without preamble. Stock price jumped another 8% since the announcement. NORAT Global Corp's acquisition team is impressed with our efficiency metrics. Carmen stared at the quarterly reports spread across the polished conference table. The numbers told a story of corporate success, reduced labor costs, streamlined operations, improved shareholder value. But now she could see the hidden story beneath those figures. Emma Miller's canceled therapy sessions, Maria Santos's custody fears, David Chen's night security shifts. "I need to discuss a change in direction," Carmen said quietly. Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Change? The merger negotiations are at a critical juncture. Any deviation from our current strategy could jeopardize the entire deal. The human cost of our efficiency measures is unsustainable," Carmen continued, her voice growing stronger. "We need to reverse the layoffs and restore the terminated contracts." The boardroom fell silent. Board member Jennifer Walsh, who'd been reviewing financial projections on her tablet, looked up with barely concealed alarm. Carmen, you're not making sense," she said. "Those terminations saved the company $43 million annually. Reversing them would be financial suicide." "Financial suicide," Carmen repeated. "Interesting choice of words, Jennifer, because that's exactly what we're committing against the families in our community." Richard leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "Your father built this company on sound business principles, not emotional decision-making. Shareholders invested their capital based on our commitment to maximizing returns. My father built this company on the principle that workers deserve dignity and security," Carmen shot back. "He believed businesses had responsibilities beyond profit margins." "Your father also died leaving the company hemorrhaging money," Richard replied coldly. "We saved Sinclair Industries by making the difficult choices he was too sentimental to make." The words hit their intended target. Carmen felt the familiar weight of guilt and obligation settling on her shoulders. For 2 years, she'd accepted that narrative, that her father's compassion had been a weakness, that survival required abandoning his values. But Emma Miller's face flashed through her mind, followed by Jake's desperate voice describing his daughter's dreams of becoming a veterinarian. "No," Carmen said firmly. "You didn't save the company. You transformed it into something my father would never recognize." She stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Somewhere down there, in apartments and community centers, people were struggling to recover from decisions made in this very room. "I'm calling for a shareholder vote to reverse the Phase 2 terminations and restore full benefits to all affected employees," Carmen announced. The boardroom erupted in angry voices. Richard's face had turned red with fury, while other board members talked over each other in heated arguments about fiduciary duty and corporate governance. "You don't have the votes," Richard said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "And even if you did, Global Corp will walk away from the merger. We'll lose the acquisition premium, stock prices will crash, and shareholders will demand your immediate resignation." "Then that's what happens," Carmen replied. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Nolan. "Board meeting today? You don't have to face this alone. Ivy and I are thinking about you." The simple message provided strength she hadn't expected. Outside this boardroom, real people were counting on her to find the courage her position demanded. "I'm also announcing the creation of a community restoration fund," Carmen continued. $50 million to help displaced workers with job training, medical expenses, and housing assistance while we rebuild local employment. $50 million? Jennifer Walsh's voice cracked with disbelief. "That's nearly your entire compensation package for the next 5 years." "Good," Carmen said. "Maybe it's time corporate executives started sharing the sacrifice instead of imposing it on everyone else." Richard stood up, his diplomatic facade completely abandoned. "This is corporate insanity, Carmen. You're destroying everything your father built." "My father built a company that cared about its workers. You turned it into a machine that devours them." The argument was interrupted by Richard's assistant entering the boardroom with obvious reluctance. She whispered something in his ear that made his face go white. "What is it?" Carmen demanded. "Channel 7 News," Richard said grimly. They're running an exposé on Sinclair Industries. Internal documents showing our merger strategy, the planned layoffs, your acquisition bonus. Carmen's heart sank. David Chen had followed through on his threat to release the evidence. The timing couldn't have been worse or better, depending on perspective. Richard activated the conference room's television, and they watched as investigative reporter Sarah Martinez detailed the company's systematic exploitation of workers to inflate stock prices. The leaked emails appeared on screen, including Carmen's own correspondence about Phase 2 eliminations and optimal termination strategies. But then the story took an unexpected turn. However, the reporter continued, sources close to the company indicate CEO Carmen Sinclair is preparing to announce major reversals of these policies in response to community pressure and worker advocacy efforts. Footage appeared of Sunday's community meeting, showing Carmen kneeling to speak with Ivy, tears streaming down her face as she listened to stories of families destroyed by corporate efficiency. This remarkable image shows Sinclair confronting the human cost of her decisions, the reporter narrated. Community leaders report she spent hours after this meeting visiting displaced workers and their families personally. Carmen watched herself on television embracing Jake Miller's daughter Emma, promising that the little girl's therapy sessions would be restored. She barely remembered making that commitment, but there it was, recorded for the world to see. The broadcast concluded with a statement from Maria Santos. Carmen Sinclair looked us in the eye and saw what her choices had done. That takes courage. Now we're waiting to see if she has the courage to fix it. The boardroom remained silent as the news segment ended. Finally, Richard spoke. Well, Carmen, it appears you've already made your decision public. The question now is whether you're prepared for the consequences. Carmen's phone buzzed again. Another message from Nolan. Ivy wants you to know that even grown-ups can change their minds when they learn something new. She says that's what makes people smart, not stubborn. A 9-year-old's wisdom cut through the complexity of corporate politics with remarkable clarity. Being smart meant adapting when you discovered you were wrong. Being stubborn meant defending mistakes until they became irreversible. Schedule the shareholder vote, Carmen told the board, and prepare the Community Restoration Fund documentation. We're going to prove that doing the right thing can also be good business. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that changed everything, Nolan stood in the renovated community center that had become the headquarters of the Sinclair Worker Cooperative. The transformation still amazed him. What had once been a failing corporation built on extraction and exploitation had evolved into something revolutionary. A business owned and operated by the very people whose labor created its value. The morning sun streamed through windows that now displayed a different kind of corporate messaging. Instead of stock prices and profit margins, the walls featured photographs of cooperative members, testimonials from families whose lives had been rebuilt, and charts tracking not just financial performance but community impact metrics. The Henderson account came through, Maria Santos announced, entering the conference room with a smile that had become common since she'd been elected to the cooperative's management council. They want to contract exclusively with us for their logistics needs. That's another 47 local jobs. Nolan made notes in the community impact ledger he maintained as the cooperative's liaison coordinator. His role had evolved naturally from that first community meeting where he'd helped bridge the gap between corporate power and neighborhood needs. Now he spent his days connecting worker owners with resources, mediating disputes, and ensuring that the cooperative's growth served the community rather than depleting it. Jake's adaptive equipment division is ahead of schedule too, Nolan added. Emma's physical therapy progress inspired him to research accessibility solutions. His team just landed a contract with the school district to improve code playground equipment for children with disabilities. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jake Miller, whose daughter's therapy had been eliminated by corporate cost-cutting, now led a division specifically focused on creating opportunities for children with special needs. Emma herself had become something of a mascot for the cooperative. her bright smile and determined spirit reminding everyone why they'd chosen transformation over traditional business models. Carmen entered the conference room carrying coffee for everyone, a small gesture that spoke volumes about how leadership had changed within the organization. Gone were the days of executive assistance and hierarchical distance. The cooperative's elected leadership worked alongside every other member, their authority derived from community trust rather than shareholder appointment. "The quarterly numbers are ready for review," she announced, distributing copies of financial reports that looked dramatically different from traditional corporate documents. Instead of focusing solely on profit maximization, the cooperative tracked multiple bottom lines: worker satisfaction, community investment, environmental impact, and sustainable growth. The financial performance was actually stronger than during the old model, proving that treating workers as partners rather than expenses created better outcomes for everyone involved. "Revenue is up 12% from last quarter," Carmen continued. "More importantly, worker owner satisfaction surveys show the highest job fulfillment ratings we've ever recorded. When people have ownership stakes in their workplace, productivity and innovation increase naturally." David Chen, who had transitioned from whistleblower to the cooperative's transparency officer, raised his hand. "The external audit confirmed our books are completely clean. No hidden expenses, no executive perks at worker expense, no accounting tricks to manipulate stock prices." His grandmother, Mrs. Chen, had moved back into her apartment after the cooperative's Housing Justice Fund helped negotiate a fair rent agreement with her landlord. David's role in exposing the old company's practices had been vindicated, and his position as transparency officer ensured that financial honesty remained central to their operations. "Which brings us to the anniversary celebration planning," Maria said, opening a folder thick with community input. "It's been exactly 1 year since the cooperative model was approved by worker vote. The neighborhood wants to organize a festival." Nolan looked around the table at faces that had once been statistics in corporate downsizing reports. Maria, whose rideshare income had been eliminated, now managed the cooperative's transportation division and earned more than she ever had as an independent contractor. Jake Miller, who'd lost his house to foreclosure, had not only bought back his family home, but was helping other displaced families access cooperative housing loans. The transformation extended beyond individual success stories. Local businesses that had struggled when the old Sinclair Industries extracted wealth from the community were now thriving. The cooperative's policy of purchasing supplies locally and banking with community financial institutions had created a multiplier effect throughout the neighborhood. "I want to share something," Carmen said, her voice carrying the warmth that had replaced her old corporate distance. "Yesterday, I received a call from Global Corp, the company that wanted to acquire us under the old model." The room grew quiet. Global Corp represented everything they'd rejected: offshore manufacturing, worker exploitation, environmental destruction in pursuit of quarterly earnings. They offered to purchase our cooperative structure and implement it across their operations. They want to license our model because their productivity and worker retention metrics can't compete with ours. Jake laughed, a sound of pure satisfaction. "They want to buy the thing they told us was impossible?" "Apparently, treating workers as human beings instead of production costs creates better business outcomes," Carmen said with a smile. "Who would have thought?" The meeting moved into planning mode for the anniversary celebration, but Nolan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a struggling single father driving for a company that viewed him as replaceable. Now he was part of a movement that was inspiring similar transformations across the country. His relationship with Carmen had evolved alongside the cooperative itself. What had begun as a professional driver arrangement, complicated by corporate deception and moral conflicts, had grown into a partnership built on shared values and genuine love. Their romance had become somewhat famous, not as a fairy tale about wealth differences, but as a story about two people finding each other while fighting for economic justice. Media coverage of their relationship focused on how love had sparked corporate transformation, but Nolan knew the reality was more complex. Love had provided the motivation, but systemic change required sustained effort, community organizing, and the courage to completely reimagine how business could operate. After the meeting ended, Carmen and Nolan walked together through the neighborhood that had become the cooperative's extended campus. They passed Jake's adaptive equipment workshop, where Emma Miller was helping test new code playground designs. They waved to Maria Santos, who was training new driver owners in the transportation division. "Do you ever miss the old life?" Carmen asked as they reached the community garden that had been planted where the old executive parking lot used to be. Nolan considered the question seriously. His income was steadier now, his relationship with Ivy was stronger, and his work felt meaningful in ways that driving for corporate executives never had. "I miss the simplicity," he admitted, "when problems seemed like someone else's responsibility, but I wouldn't trade this for anything." Ivy appeared from behind the tomato plants, her face bright with soil and satisfaction. At 10 years old, she had become the unofficial coordinator of the Children's Environmental Education Program, teaching younger kids about sustainable farming and cooperative economics. "Dad, Carmen, come see," she called excitedly. The community greenhouse produced enough vegetables to supply the food co-op for the entire month. As they walked toward Ivy's latest achievement, Nolan reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he'd picked up a wealthy passenger at the airport. That encounter had seemed like a routine assignment, but had transformed into something far more significant. Proof that love, justice, and economic democracy could flourish together. Their story had become bigger than their individual relationship. It represented the possibility of transformation, the power of community organizing, and the hope that even the most entrenched systems of exploitation could be changed when people chose cooperation over competition. Their journey from corporate exploitation to worker democracy proves that love and justice can transform entire communities. Subscribe for more stories of transformation and hope, because every ending is really just a new beginning waiting to unfold.